This podcast is brought to you by B2B Better. Most B2B podcasts rack up downloads, but they never move the needle on pipeline. At B2B Better, we build own media systems that sales teams actually use to close deals. We've helped companies turn their podcasts into revenue engines, shortening sales cycles, improving outbound reply rates, and directly influencing millions in pipeline. So if you're tired of content that looks good on paper, but doesn't drive business results, visit b2b-better.com to see how we do it differently. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Pipe Dream and our 1 in 100 series. I'm very excited today to be joined by Yiannaki Loizou, who is the Communications Marketing Director at Miratech. Yiannaki, thank you so much for coming onto the show.
Pleasure. Thanks for having me, Jason.
So we're here today to talk about the marketing funnel. It's a concept that everyone listening to this podcast will understand, and it is a concept that almost every marketer who's listening to this podcast will have been asked to build a strategy around. But the marketing funnel was built in a different era of B2B buying. I want to get your thoughts and your experience, as a marketing leader that's scaled international tech businesses. Where do you see the marketing funnel work? But more importantly, where do you see it break down in the modern day B2B buying journey? And why do you think so many organizations are still building their entire strategy around it?
Yeah, that's a great question. And I think, from my experience in marketing, like many marketeers, you kind of enter that arena, you learn about the marketing funnel and all the frameworks that go around that. But I think where it breaks down, for many years, it's like I feel like the marketing funnel is part of a movement where we're trying to turn marketing into a predictable kind of mechanical factory, because that's how you easily show ROI and maybe salesify what marketing does. But I think there's been a cost to that, and in terms of taking away some of the experimentalism and creativity that the kind of tradition of marketing has been built on. With regards to the marketing funnel, I think if you look at what that was originally set up to do, it was kind of a reporting mechanism to aggregate how groups move through a framework that we kind of describe group behavior around. I think where perhaps our kind of worshipping of the marketing funnel has gone a bit too far is it's almost now prescribing how you run things like campaigns, and assumes that individuals move in that very neat formulaic way. And I think the risk with that is it starts to encourage a kind of standardized thinking around human behavior and how decisions are made, and takes away some of the more messy attributes of human behavior that allow you to be a little bit more creative. So why it's attractive, I think, is everybody wants simple answers. This idea of a stable machine, there's a whole language built around it now as well that kind of scientifies this kind of framework, marketing attribution, lead scoring, conversion stages, and it's got this legitimacy of a science that sits behind it. But the truth is, many of the great marketing campaigns are really kind of just opening themselves up outside of this idea that it's just about the number of touch points that you have through a funnel. I sometimes say that if you serve stale bread 16 times, it's not going to build an appetite in somebody. So I think there's a little bit of a risk of moving away from what truly resonates with people, with what kind of looks good on a slide deck when it comes to reporting, and starting to build a kind of mentality around that. So it's not the marketing funnel has, I think, no place. I just think that there are some risks that we're losing some of the kind of creative sides of marketing by kind of worshipping that concept a little bit too heavily.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense. And I think it can also, and this is what I think you're alluding to here, encourage bad or maybe misguided behaviors, right? Because when you pull a funnel up onto a screen and you're presenting it to your board, and you see the words kind of like awareness, education, conversion, and then you find yourself in like a either tight macroeconomic environment or a highly competitive space, it's easy for a non-marketer to look at the conversion part of that diagram and be like, well, let's just do more of that. That sounds great. We need more conversion. and if we have to reallocate some of the budget from the awareness bit, who cares, right? Because ultimately, what we're trying to get here is pipeline and try and get deals. And I think that's what you're alluding to here, right?
Absolutely that. It's just the simplicity of, as I say, when you look at it from a group point of view, it's just like, okay, they're converted at this point in the funnel. So as you say, let's just do more of that. But the truth is that's a simplification of what's actually going on in the real world. And even the attribution of what we think is converting through those stages is a massive reduction on reality. I think that's one of the dangers. If you take the concept of, say, marketing attributed pipeline, you're usually tagging a touch point or an action to say that marketing has sort of contributed to an eventual conversion. But I think that encourages kind of a behavior that sort of games the system a little bit, right? So if you imagine, I don't know, you're a pizza shop and somebody's already walking into the to buy a pizza off you, handing them a leaflet before they walk in the shop. There's a kind of whole behavior and a context that's sitting before that tag's happening. And I think the way that model is simplifying how marketing is creating those conversion is not necessarily healthy in terms of how it matches to the reality of what's happening in the real world, and downplays some more important things, I think, around brand positioning that are perhaps harder to quantify, but that in truth, marketeers intuitively know plays a massive role in terms of that marketing mix.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, for marketers who are fighting for their lives, fighting for their careers, it makes total sense that if you are in a position where you're having to justify, or you're having to, evidence marketing influence pipeline, you're going to gravitate to the channels and the tools which give you a number that you can put on a dashboard, right? Like it's relatively easy to spin up an ad campaign targeted at a list of accounts if you've got HubSpot or a CRM set up to actually measure that, be able to attribute, okay, well, we closed 100 deals in the last, month, and I can tell you because the data is telling me that we touched X percent of those with those ads. The brand stuff, the positioning stuff, a little bit more intangible, maybe requires a slightly longer timeline, harder to measure, famously, and so as such, I'm just going to go where there's the point of least friction, the path of least resistance.
You hit the nail on the head, and I think this homogenization, standardization of marketing you mentioned around the kind of personal pressure that the people are under. If you look at even the way CVs are now being expected to be written by CMOs, even those are becoming standardized. With the way they're read with the algorithms and everything. So this predominant force around marketing funnel showing easy results, repeatability, scalability. Again, it's not that it's not important, but I think it's sometimes coming at the expense of other areas, as you say, that are sometimes harder or require more investment to measure the qualitative aspects, the anecdotal insights, what brand is. So it's just about, in my view, getting the balance between both of those things, and not kind of coming away from that tradition, as I say, around being contrarian, being experimental, being creative within the marketing space, which I think a lot of marketeers intuitively know. If they look at their most effective work, often it's something that sits outside of that marketing factory. And although it's the marketing factory that they're often demonstrating their results from, if they're fortunate enough to be in a role for an extended period of time, some of the best work kind of sits outside of that, in terms of what it's had an impact on.
Yeah, I mean, you've obviously kind of lived and breathed this, having run a number of significant rebrands across the organizations that you've worked with in your career. You're obviously clearly a massive advocate for brand work, but it is notoriously difficult to fit into this funnel logic that we're talking about because it operates on a completely different time scale. So, like, what is your approach to making the business case for this type of kind of high impact work? And do you think that the funnel model is part of the reason why brand investment is so chronically underfunded in B2B?
I don't think it's the only reason. I think, as you say, one of the big challenges with a couple of challenges in brand, I think, as you say, it's hard to quantify. If you're not a Nike and you're paying lots of agencies to talk around what the value of a brand is, if you're a B2B services company or tech company with smaller budget, like it's much easier to measure your digital pipeline than it is to say what's the value of our brand and how much of an impact is that having on our business. I think the other trouble with brand, in my experience, is a lot of people mistake what brand is. They think we operate visually. We think it's the wallpaper or the color of our website. It's only when you start talking about things like it's an articulation of your purpose, your why, what you stand for, your worldview, that people start to get a grasp of how important it is. I think the irony is brand is one of the true consistent stabilizers in this marketing mix. Campaigns often chop and change, whereas the thing that's always there with a reasonable degree of consistency is that brand. There are ways you can measure brand even for smaller businesses, and investing in that qualitative measure in terms of running surveys, the old-fashioned stuff. What do you think of our brand? What do our customers think of our brand? How much of a weighting does it have in terms of their propensity to stay with us as a business? Being honest with you, though, the biggest way I've started, by hook or by crook, my career's had a lot of kind of positioning and branding projects. And yes, I'm a big advocate for brand being really important. I think bringing to life and asking people what truly makes them make decisions. When I'm selling brand projects into executive teams, it's often asking them, what really matters to you? Is it the things that we're pretending on the purely rational level, or is there something deeper around who you want to work with, who you look for as your kind of flagship companies? And I think when you start posing those questions to people, it points towards a deeper human reality where people start being honest about themselves outside of the slide decks.
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, I think, B2B, has this reputation that it is B2B buying behavior is super logical, right? And it's like looking at numbers on a piece of paper and making a decision based on those numbers, and that there's no emotion in these decisions. But, I've worked in house most of my career. I've sat across the table from brands that are, looking to take on a vendor and commit potentially millions of dollars, right, in tech spend over the course of 3, 4 years. And once they're locked in, they're locked in. That is a huge emotional decision for someone to be making, right? Whatever way you look at it, you are going to be on the hook as a B2B buyer, based on whether or not this implementation or this technology performs as you expect it to be for your business. And so, yes, you want to understand the numbers, you want to understand the feature set, you want to understand the technical abilities of whatever it is that you're buying, but you also want to feel that, the brand, and importantly the people sat across the table, from you, are in your corner, right? Or that they've been through this before. They are going to be able to help you identify the challenges and the opportunities that perhaps you aren't even thinking about. And it's not just, I think, as a B2B brand, how do you articulate that in the moment when someone is actually sitting down saying, like, right, we have a budget and we're ready to spend, but how are you, positioning yourself to be that credible partner in the 3, 6, 9, 12, 36 months prior to them ever getting into the room with you. I'd love to get your kind of thoughts around that.
I think you hit the nail on the head. I think you can talk about reach and resonance, right? So as you say, like when it's just about those numbers, number of touch points or whatever, whereas to create resonance requires deeper meaning. And I think where that space is it's hitting on the emotions of people. And without becoming too theoretical, there's a whole load of research in behavior economics that we rationalize and like to think of ourselves as rational, but the truth is there's a huge space in emotional drivers that actually determine the behaviors that we take, with the choices we make rather. So, but as you say, in the B2C space, that kind of seems to be quite cleanly recognized. In the B2B space, because it's business, we like to pretend that everything is a lot more rational. Hence why I think the funnel has a really strong kind of overweighting, and all those rational simplifications around how humans are going to behave takes pride of place. So I think, and the other challenge as well in B2B is we often think of, we're often communicating to organizations rather than individuals. So it's much harder to humanize the audiences that we are talking to. But within those organizations are real people like me and you. So they have the same drivers, as you say, as anyone else, the same fears, the same goals. To one extent or another. So, I mean, I often refer to it as H2H. Instead of B2B or B2C, think human to human. And I think that encourages a marketing approach that's much more around resonance, and making sure that you don't fall into the trap of thinking about your audiences as these homogenous groups of stats on a slide deck, and kind of really unpack what the kind of deeper human drivers are of our audiences. I think it's important to keep track of that. And if I may kind of just add one anecdote that kind of shows or tests to that a little bit. I remember many years ago going on a marketing masterclass course and sat in a room and being taught all these B2B frameworks in terms of what we're talking about, the funnel marketing attribution models. And yet all the examples of best practice came out the B2C space and were kind of almost creative advertising campaigns. Like, like intuitively we knew these were the things that actually persuaded people to do something. So you kind of that mismatch of kind of what we're taught and theory versus what we know to be more effective by virtue of being human beings was kind of there in full display, really.
Yeah. I remember seeing something very similar at B2B Marketing Expo a couple of years ago up at the Excel in London, and it was exactly that. It was, I think it might have been the LinkedIn B2B Institute talking about kind of B2B marketing best practice, and yet all of the examples they were giving were consumer-facing brands. And I remember sitting there and turning to my colleague and being like, "This feels a little bit. There's a mismatch here.
Yeah,
Do they
absolutely.
really struggle?" I'd like you maybe just to have a think about a B2B campaign that you've seen and loved. And whilst you're doing that, what one to me that kind of sticks out that I always refer to is a campaign from a brand called Trainual. And Trainual, their CMO over there is a gentleman called Jonathan Ronzio. We've done episodes with him on Pipedream before. We'll drop the link in the show notes of this episode. And I first came across Trainual because I'm a huge Office fan, right? Like the US Office. I even have a tattoo of a beat, Dwight Schrute, on my arm. Um, and anything to do with The Office, I will watch. And I remember getting served an ad in my Instagram feed one afternoon, or one evening actually, where it featured the actors from The Office, not like not reprising their roles, but talking with the kind of characteristics of their roles. And they were talking about how, in their kind of characters, they would be served by using Trainual's platform, which was all around kind of SOP development, employee training, education, etc. And it was funny and it was light and it was clearly recorded, from Cameo. They'd hired these actors to do, like $100, just give me 30 seconds of you reading this script. But it really resonated with me. And I picked up the phone. I'm talking to Trainual, figuring out how we can try and bring them into our business. And I remember talking to Jonathan about it afterwards on an episode of B2B Better, a Pipe Dream. And, he said to me, our ethos is, how do we create great content that's going to resonate with people outside of 9 to 5? Like, it's easy for me to create content that people are going to sit down at their desk and read, like a white paper or, a webinar or whatever. But to get something that like piques interest when they're sat on the couch at night, next to their loved ones, just doom scrolling, like that is what we're aiming for. And that really, really stuck with me at the time. And they've gone on to do like hip hop music videos with like 90s R&B artists and like a ton of crazy stuff. But someone that really, a brand that really just kind of like lives and breathes this kind of ethos of like how do we resonate with our customers, and how do we like articulate our values to them, 365 days a year, 24/7.
Values being a key word there again, in terms of that, not just a functional kind of description of what they do, but as you say, kind of going deeper than that. And you use the word resonance again in your description, which I think again points to how important that is. It's difficult. I mean, I think in terms of my own memories, it's funny, isn't it? Again, when you ask that question, you always veer towards B2C sometimes, and I think that says something. I remember though, and it was a few years back now, Volvo doing I thought, just a really nice concept that brought a lot of the B2C shine into the B2B world, which was they had Jean-Claude Van Damme, which perhaps has some nostalgia from my own youth, but he was kind of doing the splits between they were running an ad campaign, and he was kind of doing the splits between two of their Volvo trucks, kind of showing the precision of all their brand values in terms of what their machinery stands for, in terms of that precision and reliability. You can trust it basically with your own life when you're kind of doing the splits Van Damme between two trucks. And again, they didn't need to over literalize and kind of have a bullet point esque kind of description of the I don't know, the value prop of a Volvo truck. There was a much kind of wider emotional push about what Volvo stand for as a partner to, I guess in this case, logistics companies. And again, I think that trust in audience, understanding they're human, understanding that, wow, okay, that kind of punches a message that feels different to getting a PDF from another truck company about why our trucks are just kind of slightly more efficient, or, will improve your fuel efficiency, productivity, whatever it's going to be. I think, again, that stood out in terms of its respect for the fact that doing something a bit braver than that will count for a lot.
Yeah. We've obviously spent, 20 minutes now talking about how the funnel is, or the marketing funnel is like fundamentally broken, and how it can kind of like encourage bad behaviors within B2B organizations.
If it goes too far.
Well, I mean, that kind of, like, that's my point, right? Like, there are obviously circumstances, or I'm keen to get your thoughts on, like, what are the circumstances in which the marketing funnel, in the way that we've described, does make sense or does offer value to organizations? Like, where does it work?
What we already use it for, I think, is if it's seen as a reporting mechanism for group behavior, and we don't over rely on it in terms of it's explaining individual behavior within that funnel. It has its value, particularly with campaigns, I believe, in terms of showing, particularly in the digital sphere, how people are moving through various touch points. But I think, as I say, I wouldn't kind of just say, and this shows the value of what marketing is for this company, because you risk kind of a salesification of marketing off the back of that. If I take my own experience in tech companies, we've had multi-million kind of attributed pipelines, but I know the biggest stuff we've done that we kind of formed bigger deals, bigger joint ventures off the back of it wasn't to do with that marketing factory that we were also reporting on. So, as I said, I don't think I have a great insight on there. It's just to put it in its right place and not lose sight of that. If it's taken too literally, it can create a culture of safetyism. It can remove the experimentalism of doing some great things that marketing departments are uniquely placed to offer a business. So I think that's my only point I'd make, is to put it in balance and not lose that. And that role of marketing is to create that differential within a business, that it's not really just another sales department doing things with words.
Yeah, and coloring things in. Um, I think the funnel obviously, is adopted and appreciated because of the simplicity, in the fact, that it's a diagram, right? I've seen other versions of the funnel, like spider webs and, like wheel and spokes and all sorts of, crazy stuff. Just to bring us into your role, right? And how you're talking about marketing and communications within the businesses that you've worked at. As you're trying to explain, okay, brand versus demand, this is how we're and where we're investing on one side, this is how and where we're investing on the other side, here's how it all kind of feeds together and then ultimately results in the things we care about: pipeline, revenue, and profit. What does that look like for you? Do you start with the funnel and then caveat everything that we've spoken about today, or is there another way of visualizing and explaining what are quite, complex topics to a diverse audience internally?
To answer that last question, I think you have to start with brand. Certainly, my experience, if you try to build demand campaigns off the back of a dodgy brand, you're fighting a losing battle. At some point, people are going to come back to brand at some point and make a decision around that. So, I don't think you can do effective marketing without a really solid brand, whatever that means, sat behind you. So, for me, I always have to start with, what do we stand for as a company? Does that resonate? How do we make our audiences feel? The broader brand proposition before we worry about the mechanics of our demand programs. Again, there's no magic wand to that, but I think I certainly, in my case, I advocate for that internally, and it's difficult. Obviously, sometimes, as I say, people expect really fast results, and so the temptation to go to, look, here's our touch points, and here's our digital performance, and here's our conversion rates on these kind of things. The problem is, you're setting yourself up for a fall over the long game. I think that if you don't push back a little bit and say, if you don't have the brand in place, we're always going to be working with a handicap, then I think eventually it becomes more and more challenging as you launch more and more things around demand. So I think you should always start with brand. And I think, one of the hardest things, particularly for marketing departments today, is to say no and to advocate for what you shouldn't be doing. And I think, we all struggle with that sometimes, as you say, like with the coloring in department, with the writing department, the requests that come in can often make marketing a big challenge to stay strategic, as opposed to just being kind of this execution department was simple and fast results. So, but I think, that's the important thing that we've got to be able to do over the longer term. Otherwise, the challenge is for building brand, for being that experimental department, for being the point of difference, the contrarian sometimes, is going to be completely eroded. And I think it's hard to be effective without those things in place.
Yeah, absolutely. Look, as we look at bringing this episode to a close, I'd love to get some super tactical advice from you for B2B marketing leaders who are listening to this episode. They're nodding their heads along with everything that we're saying, but they're looking
Or
for
shaking.
some, yeah, or shaking, yeah, exactly. But they're looking for something they can kind of like, take away and focus on over the next 90 days. So when it comes to building brand, when it comes to building the right foundation so that the demand campaigns that your team are breathing down your neck to start running are going to perform exponentially better 3 months from now, 6 months from now. What are the 3 or 4 things that you would be focusing on as a B2B marketing leader?
I think the first thing is to be the advocate for what you believe in. Even if you're shaking your head in this, I think it's very easy to, marketing departments. Sometimes they're owned by CROs. Certainly, there's often a kind of it's all about the sales kind of funnel thing. And I think arguing for the space, or forgive me, arguing for the space of what marketing represents slightly outside of that arena, is an important thing. And that's about building a relationship based on trust rather than allowing that standardization model to own you. So and the saying no thing I just said there as well. What should we be doing, but also what shouldn't we be doing? It's very easy to say yes to everything. So I think that's important, just in terms of the mindset approach. Um, I would say never forget the art of marketing, the distinctiveness aspects, the emotional things we spoke about, how it creates cultural relevance, standing for something. When you actually see marketing at its most effective, it really encroaches across an entire business, not just kind of as a sort of supportive sales function, and that really transforms quite a lot. So I think that aspect of it is really important. That not to just frame ourselves as sort of at best a partner to sales. And having said that, when we are a partner for sales, I think the other thing is to make sure that we are a partner as opposed to a support function. And I think where we can come away from these piecemeal attributions of marketing did this, sales did that, and work in more holistic ways, we can build that confidence. I think the earlier you can do that in your first 90 days, the better, again, the longer term, and your marketing engine over the longer term. Um, and I think the biggest thing, again, I think maybe there's a repeated point one, which is just to make sure that marketing doesn't fall into the trap of it's just a lead gen machine. And that requires a lot of internal education often, particularly, as I say, in the B2B space. So own that narrative, be confident around it, talk about the other things that marketing can be adding value to, and lean on your experience. Often marketeers have a lot of experience, and they are a different voice in the room. And I think we should celebrate that.
Yeah, well, I couldn't agree more. And one thing I'd add to your final point there is, you know, I have found it much easier in my career to advocate for this type of approach when you do have someone outside of marketing in your camp within the wider organization. So I often look to the sales team, like often there will be someone within that within that sales function who intuitively believes and understands in this idea of brand, and if we're out there, we're positioning ourselves as thought leaders, we're present in the channels that modern day B2B buyers are spending their time in. We're adopting this kind of long term mentality, the compounding effect of brand. I have found it much smoother to then go into leadership meetings and present it as a unified front.
Draw on your allies.
Draw on your allies. Yeah, exactly. And start small, because I think sometimes marketers, they feel a bit trapped, particularly if they've been within an organization for a long time and like there's a certain status quo in terms of how we operate, and it feels like the only way I'm going to be able to get out of this is to literally get out of the company and go somewhere new. I think you can encourage change within a business, but I think it becomes smoother sailing when you've got other allies, like to use your word, that you can kind of present a unified front, a kind of like a pilot campaign, or some sort of starter story, and based on us seeing these milestones, we will continue to invest in these ways, right? Just making it palatable rather than like a full blown reset.
you made another great point there, which is pick the things that matter most. As you say, start small. It's so often the case that you're asked to do everything, as I say, launch campaigns. There's no brand there. And that's one of the hardest things. What are the things that we should matter? Or so what are the things that we should focus on that matter most, and stick with discipline to them before we build out? So that's also, apart from the allies thing, something that can really help to organically build a more sustainable marketing function.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, this has been an absolute masterclass in B2B marketing strategy and the role of the funnel in modern day marketing. Where can people learn more about you if they want to continue the conversation?
That's a good question. I'm on LinkedIn. I should be more active, but I certainly respond to reach outs on inboxes, and love having chats with anyone who wants to discuss anything about marketing. So yes, you can find me on LinkedIn, where you can find most of us.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll be dropping the link to your LinkedIn profile in the show notes of this episode. But thank you so much, man, for this episode and this interview. It's been a great conversation, and I look forward to speaking to you again down the line.
Thanks very much, Jason.